America absolutely dominated the 1968 Olympics in Mexico City, sending almost double the amount of athletes to the top of the podium to receive a gold medal than the second place country. But looking back from today, maybe more important than any competition or race or athletic achievement was a subtle but powerful message during a medal ceremony where two African American athletes raised a fist in protest. For this, they were thrown out of the Olympic Village, shamed by many, called unpatriotic, but succeeded in raising awareness of the problems facing Black Americans and motivated others to rise and fight for justice. But what caused these two athletes to raise their fists in protest? And what did it symbolize? Well, I'm glad you asked. I'm Dan Luer, and this is History for Humans. In the whole history of the Olympics, this is one of the most famous pictures that is not actually of athletes in competition. In it, you see three athletes, all of whom were actually involved in this protest, though you might only think two were from the looks of it. Peter Norman, the Australian silver medalist, is on the left, then Tommie Smith, the gold medalist, and John Carlos with the bronze. Carlos and Smith both have their hands raised, and you should notice that right away. But what you maybe can't tell, but should be able to infer if you thought about it, is at the moment that they were raising their fists, the national anthem, the Star-Spangled Banner, was playing. Although it might seem that the raised fists are the only symbolic thing in this picture, there's actually much more going on than first meets the eye. And in today's lessons, we'll be telling the story of this image and of this moment, but also the story of how the civil rights movement in the late 1960s transformed and the Black Power movement began. Our exploration question for today is what caused these two athletes to raise their fists in protest? And how did the Black Power movement change the civil rights era? So really try to focus your attention on answering that. And to do so, we actually had to jump back a few years before the Olympics began to discover what was going on here and what led those fists to be raised. From our last three videos, you should know that the civil rights movement began in 1955. So at this point, it had been going on for pretty much a decade and was achieving significant victories in law, in the courts, and in the minds of many Americans. However, at this time, with the growing popularity of a more militant approach that was being advocated most famously by Malcolm X, the movement was starting to splinter. It was in 1966 that the movement really shifted. This is not long after the passage of the Voting Rights Act, and the first era of the movement was really categorized by peaceful, nonviolent demonstrations, mostly in the South. Then the movement will swing north and grow increasingly radical and more adamant in demanding economic as well as equal rights. In 1966, James Meredith was completing a march against fear from Memphis, Tennessee to Jackson, Mississippi. When he was getting into Mississippi, he was shot by white racists. After visiting him in the hospital, Stokely Carmichael, who's going to be an important figure in this story, was recently appointed to be the leader of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And he decided with others that they should finish the march in his place. On the march, they experienced racist insults and attacks, and all the while, white police simply looked the other way. And it was in this moment that it became clear to Carmichael that despite a decade of protests and supposedly landmark victories, that still not much had changed. And just after that, at a rally, Carmichael uttered a phrase that took the whole movement in the new direction, stating, "We've been saying freedom for 6 years. What we're going to start saying now is Black Power. We want Black Power. We want Black Power." And so he went on. Black Power in many ways was the new anthem of the civil rights movement. There will still be those who are following King's movement of peaceful nonviolence, but clearly after this, the energy of the movement shifted in favor of the more militant Black Power groups. Stokely Carmichael himself really embodies this whole change. At first, he was committed to nonviolent resistance. He joined the movement at a young age after seeing a sit-in on TV and realized the courage of these protesters and decided he couldn't sit by any longer. He then joined CORE, and he took part and was the youngest person arrested during the Freedom Rides. He registered thousands of disenfranchised Black voters during Freedom Summer and the voting education program. And just 3 weeks before James Meredith was shot in Mississippi, he was appointed the national chairman of SNCC. Under his leadership, SNCC transformed, and they no longer adhered to nonviolence and instead adopted Malcolm X's platform of getting civil rights by any means necessary, using force or violence if necessary.
Wait, but they were the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. It's in the name.
You're right, it made it a bit awkward. So Carmichael with SNCC just simply changed the name Nonviolence to National, and they became the Student National Coordinating Committee. And besides embracing any means necessary, under Carmichael's leadership, they started to embrace the ideas of Black nationalism and Black separatism. And it was during this time that SNCC actually removed all their white members to ensure that the group was not just for Blacks, but being led by Blacks. And CORE, one of the oldest civil rights groups that was committed to nonviolence, transformed in much the same ways. The Black Power movements was also preaching pride in their African heritage and a rejection of assimilating into white culture. Black is beautiful was a slogan, and many youths proudly wore their natural afros and donned African colors in their clothes, the red, the black, and the green, to show support for Africa, their heritage, and Black power. And that Black power was on the minds of Tommie Smith and John Carlos when they were heading into the 1968 Olympics. The protest during the ceremony actually began a few months before the Olympics even started. You see, 1968 was one of the most turbulent years in American history, but it was also a dramatic year of turmoil across the whole world. So, leading up to the Olympics, Carlos and Smith helped organize the Olympic Project for Human Rights. That was a largely Black movement from many different countries. And they had many demands that included support for Black athletes and Black coaches, but they really were fighting for an end to Black suffering and oppression around the world. In the games, America was simply cleaning house across the board. In the end, they won a total of 45 gold medals. Soviet Union, who of course was our main rival as we were involved in the Cold War at this time, was in second, and they just had 29. And in third place was Japan with just 11. In the 200 meter, Carlos and Smith were the running favorites. Get it? Running favorite. And whereas Smith won and took first place, setting a world record with a time of 19.83 seconds, the Australian Peter Norman, out of nowhere, shocked the crowd and the runners with a second place finish, edging Carlos by 0.4 of a second. And as shocking as his finish was, more shocking would be the role he would play in the protest and the severe consequences that ended his career afterwards. And that is because Black power seemed to a lot of white Americans and white Australians to represent a serious threat to the mainstream culture. And maybe the Black Panther Party can best show why that was. So let's go there.
Yes, Wakanda. The Black Panther is my favorite.
Oh, no, Chloe. Sorry to disappoint. We're not talking Marvel here, and we're not going to jump into Wakanda. We're jumping into Oakland, California. That is where the Black Panthers originated, and from there they would later influence Stan Lee's Black Panther in the Marvel Universe. So it was the same year that Stokely Carmichael's SNCC embraced Black Power, 1966, that two other activists, Huey Newton and Bobby Seale, formed the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, later just known as the Black Panther Party or the Black Panthers. Their mission, as you can tell from some of the images, was to actually protect their neighborhood from the police. Believing the police acted more as an occupying army that brutalized the Black community, the Panthers started to patrol Oakland and actually police the police. Gun laws at the time in the state allowed for carrying weapons in public for self-defense. And the Panthers took to exercising those rights and shocked a lot of the country when they branded shotguns and rifles and pistols in public, dressed in black pants, black leather jackets, and black berets. And they looked much like a military unit, especially when they started to do drills in public. You see, they believed they were actually taking power back in the community and giving it to the people. They would monitor police radios and then try to beat the police to the scene and inform people of their rights, sometimes shouting from across the street, all the while holding guns in hand. Though the brandishing of weapons and militancy is all that many Americans, especially white Americans, knew about the Panthers, they were also providing free breakfasts to the poor children of their neighborhoods and had clinics to provide health care and education. And kind of most famously, a 10-point program of demands that included basic things like freedom, but went so far as to demand full employment and housing for the Black community, releasing from jail all Black people, and exemption from military service. So I hope you could see that these demands in the 10-point program that were being made by other Black power groups went well beyond the demands of the early civil rights movement, like the ability to vote or just to sit at a lunch counter or at the front of the bus. Put simply, Blacks across the country, especially young Blacks, were tired of waiting and pushing for small incremental changes. No, they were ready to make heavy demands on a government that for too long had denied fully representing them. Stokely Carmichael later joined the Panthers, and then SNCC thereafterwards fell apart due to internal disagreements on which way the group should go forward with civil rights. And the Panthers too would meet a similar fate in the end. The head of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, actually stated the Black Panther Party, without question, represents the greatest threat to the internal security of the country. The FBI had a program, COINTELPRO, to monitor and harass and play on internal rivalries between members of the Panthers, which ultimately led to so much infighting that the group dissolved in 1982. Another major event that's often attributed with the rise of Black Power and the growing militancy of the movement were the increasing riots in northern cities, especially the Watts Riot in Los Angeles. It was a week of looting, burning, and destruction of property in this almost entirely black neighborhood, with chants of "burn, baby, burn" echoing throughout. It left almost 36 people killed, almost all of them African Americans. It had began after a police officer arrested a black man for drinking and driving, and soon a fury of unrest swallowed the neighborhood. Watts might have been a powder keg, just ready to explode. It had many of the necessary ingredients. High unemployment, poor schools, only about a third of the people graduating from high school, and little opportunities for those who did. Many saw the police themselves as part of the problem. Other cities with similarly grim statistics witnessed horrific riots of their own. Detroit was set ablaze and over 40 people died. Newark, New Jersey saw city-shaking riots that took the lives of 25 people, again, almost entirely African American. Now, while this was going on, Martin Luther King was working tirelessly against the use of violence and trying to convince his fellow African Americans not to riot, not only because they were dangerous and ineffective, but they were detrimental to the cause of empowering blacks. Still, he understood many of the underlying reasons why these riots were occurring, saying the riot is the language of the unheard. Even former President Kennedy had said, "Those who make peaceful revolution impossible make violent revolution inevitable." You see, people left hopeless and apart from a system will often, even if ultimately self-defeating, turn their rage on that system and maybe just burn it down. Demands from Black Power groups were aimed at addressing a lot of these underlying issues that exploded in riots. Then worse riots swept the nation in 1968 after Martin Luther King himself was assassinated. And it was just months after that that Smith and Carlos decided to make a statement of their own. After the race, Smith and Carlos agreed they would risk severe backlash from their fans, fellow Olympians, and Americans back home in order to raise awareness of issues facing Black America and stand in solidarity with the controversial Black Power movement. At the same time, Australia was undergoing racial tensions of their own due to racist policies that favored white European immigrants and a brutal history with the native Aborigines of Australia. And Peter Norman wanted to do something to stand for justice and equality. Talking with the Americans after the race, he wanted to show solidarity with them as well and agreed to wear a badge for human rights. The three took to the podium, accepted their medals, and when the Star-Spangled Banner was playing, the two raised a black-gloved fist to symbolize the Black Power movement and Black strength. They both also wore no shoes and black socks to represent poverty in Black communities. Carlos wore a necklace to represent the victims of lynching. As they raised their fists, many in the crowd sneered and booed. Later, they were ridiculed back home by the press and called unpatriotic. And 2 days after the ceremony, they were kicked out of the Olympic Village. And I'm sure, just as their hands were earlier, they had their heads held high, knowing that their stance did exactly what they hoped for, raised awareness and got people talking about the issues that mattered to their community. And though they faced some pressure back home after this event, they were actually able to continue on with their athletic careers, and both later played professional football. But for Peter Norman in Australia, it was a much different story altogether. His athletic career was destroyed by his quiet stance in solidarity with Carlos and Smith. And although he had qualified for the following Olympics, setting a national record in trials, Australia chose not to send anybody rather than have Norman represent their country. The raised fists and black rights, of course, echo on today. The parallels are striking, and with the controversy surrounding Colin Kaepernick's kneeling during the national anthem, I do hope that you see that history is indeed living through us. So let us have the good sense and courage to look back and learn what lessons they grant us. Thanks for engaging in history today. This has been History for Humans. Okay guys, got another great lesson for you today. You're first going to be reading a primary source, and that's the Black Panthers Party's 10-point program that we mentioned earlier in the lecture. At first, you're going to answer some basic comprehension and summarizing questions that maybe you think's a little boring, but it's important to make sure you understand it. Then you're going to answer some critical thinking or digging deeper questions. Then in the second part of the lesson, you're going to design a protest fist with the things that matter to you and that you would fight for yourself. You can either use the outline of the fist we provide or draw your own if you're more artistically inclined. And what you're going to be doing is filling your fists with images and symbols. You got to create a slogan and a motto for your group. And then below it, explain why that movement matters to you. Okay, I hope you enjoy it. Good luck. Be awesome. I'll catch you guys later.